My father didn't scream when he burned my belongings. He wanted the neighbors to hear the fire instead. He stood in the backyard with a garden hose in one hand and a lighter in the other, and he made sure the flames were tall enough to be seen over the fence. My clothes, my notebooks, my winter coat I bought with my own tips, and the quilt my grandmother stitched during the last winter of her life. He fed it all into a steel barrel like he was disposing of trash. Then he raised his voice, just loud enough for the street to catch it. This is what happens when you disobey me. 6 years later, that same man would stand in that same yard and realize he no longer owned the ground beneath his feet. But that night, I was 17, and everything I had fit inside a burn barrel. Outside, our house looked stable. Trim lawn, clean driveway, a man who waved at neighbors on Sunday mornings. Inside, it ran on rules that bent only one direction. Dinner at 6, silence during the news, no locked doors, no secrets. My father believed control was love. If he decided something, that was the final version of reality. My older brother learned how to orbit that gravity without friction. I learned how to shrink. I wanted to go to college, the air in the kitchen shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. My father didn't yell. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me like I had miscalculated something obvious. College for what? He asked. You'll get married, degrees don't cook dinner. My mother stood at the sink, her hands still in the water long after the dishes were done. She didn't defend him, she didn't defend me, she survived him. And survival in that house required silence. A promise. My grandmother, before cancer hollowed her out, told me I had a sharp mind. She said it like it was something valuable. She stitched that quilt for 3 winters, square by square, while chemo made her hands shake. Lavender sewn into the seams, fabric from dresses we both wore. She told me to leave this town one day, to use my brain. I promised her I would, so I applied to college in secret, library computers, cleared search history, saved drafts. Every click felt illegal, every submission felt like oxygen. No was that my father monitored the school system's parent alerts. The week I accessed scholarship pages 4 times, he got an email. Vision was off when I came home that Thursday. That should have warned me. He was sitting upright in his chair, not reclined. That was worse. He didn't shout. He asked one question. I answered honestly. That honesty cost me everything I owned. To the garage and came back with a trash bag. Outside, a man performing inventory. No hesitation, no anger, just decision. Shirts, jeans, sketchbooks, the second-hand novels I hid under my mattress. He bent the covers to make them fit. When he grabbed the quilt, I stepped forward without thinking. Please, I said. It was the only time I begged in that house. He didn't look at me. She spoiled you, he said about my grandmother. Then he carried it downstairs. Errol was already in the yard. He had planned this. The smell cut through the October air, then the flame. Cotton shrinks fast, paper curls in on itself, the fire climbed, heat touched my face, my drawings blackened, the coat I saved for disappeared in seconds. Then he dropped the quilt and last night all at once. It resisted. Lavender turned to smoke. 3 winters of my grandmother's hands disappear in under 4 minutes. The hose steady, not for my things, for the grass, protecting what mattered. What happens when you disobey me? He announced again, louder. Why? Because something inside me shut down to survive what my eyes were seeing. I lay on a bare mattress in a room that smelled like lighter fluid and ash, staring at I didn't pack a bag, I didn't write a note. When your father burns your belongings to prove you have nothing, packing becomes symbolic, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. I waited until the house went quiet, until his footsteps stopped moving across the floorboards, until the television clicked off and the deadbolt slid into place. Then my bedroom door opened without a knock. My mother stepped inside like a shadow that had finally chosen a direction. She didn't turn on the light, she didn't sit down, she pressed an envelope into my hand. We're shaking. Inside were my birth certificate, my social security card, and $320 in cash. It felt heavier than it should have. Go, she whispered. "Don't wait." She didn't cry. That was the strangest part. It was the first time I realized crying had never actually protected her from anything. 20 minutes after she left, long enough for the house to settle, long enough to know if I stayed, the fire would not be the last lesson. Then I pushed open my window, swung my legs over the sill, and dropped into the cold side yard with nothing but jeans, a t-shirt, and a decision. 3 houses down and knocked on Mrs. Delaney's door. She had seen the smoke earlier. She opened the door before I could knock twice. She didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside and said, "Come in." My father had already rewritten the story. He didn't look for me. She ran away, he told them. Ungrateful, always dramatic. The narrative was sealed. I wasn't a daughter who left after humiliation. I was a rebellious teenager who couldn't handle rules. The version that protects a man's pride always travels faster than the truth. At a youth shelter that night, metal bunk beds, fluorescent lights that hummed like insects, girls who didn't ask why I was there because they already knew the shape of that answer. I clutched the envelope under my pillow like it was oxygen. I'm around 3 in the morning, staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine, I realized something painful. Nothing. Freedom doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels unstable, like standing on ice that hasn't decided if it will hold you. I worked wherever someone would hire a 17-year-old without a permanent address. Night shifts. Gas station counters behind smudged plexiglass. I learned how to scan lottery tickets and read men's moods in under 2 seconds. I learned how to sleep lightly. I learned how to stretch ramen into 2 meals. I also learned something else. Money moves quietly. Account with only my name on it, no cosigner, no oversight, no one asking what I spent or why. It was a small number at first, then slightly larger. Watching it grow felt illegal, like I was hoarding power. Later, I passed my GED, 91st percentile in math. I didn't celebrate. I just sat in the testing center parking lot and stared at the steering wheel, thinking about how small my father had tried to make me feel for wanting more. In community college the following semester, business administration, not because it was glamorous, because I wanted to understand leverage, debt, ownership, the architecture beneath control. Time I heard things. My brother's auto shop, funded by my father, big launch, big sign, big risk, he had taken a loan against the house to finance it. $1,000. The same house he claimed was proof of discipline. The same house he used to threaten me. I didn't react, I didn't comment, I just remembered. Because here's something I began to understand in those years. Men who confuse control. The foreclosure listing appeared like any other. Address, lot size, auction date, legal language designed to sound unemotional, but my hands went cold when I read it. Yes. The house with the burned barrel in the yard. The house where he said, "My house, my rules." He had refinanced it twice, borrowed against it, doubled down when the business faltered, pride stacked on debt, debt stacked on denial, and now the bank was taking it back. Felt vindicated. Instead, I felt calm. Investment, estimated value after repairs, market comps, equity margin, it made financial sense. Cold, clean, logical. Wasn't the only reason I wanted it. I wanted to stand in that yard again without shrinking. I wanted the soil under my feet to answer to my name. The night before the auction, I didn't sleep much, not because I was nervous about the money, but because I was aware of what this meant. If I bought that house, the story would flip permanently. The room was smaller than I expected, folding chairs, investors with neutral expressions. The bidding moved fast. He answered on the first ring. Hello. Rougher but still certain. Check your mailbox, I said. Up. That envelope was a photograph of me standing in front of the house, holding the deed. On the back, I had written one sentence. Days. Mrs. Delaney later told me he stood at the mailbox for a long time, not moving, not shouting, just holding the paper like it was written in a language he didn't understand. All immediately. He showed up 2 days later. In front of coworkers, clients. He walked in with the same posture he always had, rigid, expecting the room to adjust. But this time, the room didn't bend. This is funny, he demanded. I stood up slowly, calmly. It's legal, I said. You stopped paying, the bank filed, I bid. Tightened, that's my house. It was, I replied. For the first time in his life, his authority hit a wall that didn't move. Anger, he tried guilt, he tried rewrite. On day 27, he didn't argue, he didn't threaten, and he didn't come back to my office to shout in front of strangers again. He packed. Mrs. Delaney called that afternoon and told me she watched him from her porch as he loaded a borrowed pickup truck in slow, deliberate movements. Not rushed, not frantic, just measured, as if he were dismantling something he once believed permanent. The recliner went first, of course it did, because even when everything else falls apart, a man like him saves the throne. Then boxes, then tools, then a duffel bag that looked too small to contain a life. He didn't look toward the mailbox, didn't glance at the yard, didn't pause at the front door. He simply drove away without ceremony. That unsettled me more than anger ever could have. I had prepared myself for rage, for accusations, for one final explosion of control. I wasn't prepared for quiet surrender. Later, I stood inside the house with a locksmith while the old locks were removed. The metallic grind of the drill echoed through the hallway, sharp and decisive, and when the new keys slid into my hand, the weight of them felt colder than I expected. Ownership is strange when it carries memory. The house smelled stale, like closed windows and unspoken things. The carpet was worn thin in pathways that traced years of routine. The kitchen faucet dripped steadily into a sink stained with neglect, and I noticed something almost ironic. He had protected the lawn with a hose that night, but he hadn't protected the house when it actually needed care. Pride had always been external with him. Inside, things quietly deteriorated. Room to room slowly, not as a daughter returning, but as an investor assessing structure, foundation, plumbing lines, resale potential. It was easier to think in numbers than in memories. But when I stepped into the back bedroom, my old room, the air shifted. The gym equipment was gone, yet the indentations on the floor remained, faint outlines where my past had been overwritten. In the closet, on a high shelf, there was a crushed shoebox coated in dust. I almost ignored it, almost left it as another forgotten relic, but something told me to reach for it. Inside were 3 charcoal sketches, edges burned but centers intact, and beneath them, folded carefully into a square no bigger than my palm, a piece of fabric, singed at one side, lavender barely lingering in the threads. Quilt fabric. He had gone into the ashes. After the flames died down and the neighbors went back inside, and I lay on that bare mattress pretending I didn't feel hollow, he had reached into that barrel and pulled something out. He kept it. For 6 years. Hidden, untouched, never mentioned. That discovery complicated something inside me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Cruelty is simple to categorize. Regret hidden in silence is not. And sitting on the floor of that empty room holding that fragile square of fabric, I realized the story I had carried for 6 years was not as clean as I thought. He had destroyed without hesitation, but he had also preserved without confession. And that contradiction would follow me into the next decision I had to make. I thought buying the house would feel like victory, something cinematic and triumphant, but instead it felt like weight, like being handed responsibility for a structure built on tension and silence. My mother was still living there when he left, which surprised more people than it surprised me. For 25 years, she had lived in a house she didn't legally own, under rules she didn't write, breathing carefully so as not to provoke weather she could not control. When I called her after the locks were changed, her voice sounded different, not louder, but less compressed, as if something inside her chest had finally expanded. I asked her one simple question, "Do you want to stay?" And there was a long pause, the kind where someone is measuring fear against hope, habit against possibility. When she said yes, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, almost fragile, as if she expected the permission to be revoked. Offer her charity? I offered her structure. A simple lease agreement, a small monthly amount that allowed her to feel like a tenant with rights instead of a guest waiting for rules. Ownership changes dynamics, and I refused to recreate the imbalance I had escaped. We replaced the roof first, charcoal gray instead of faded brown, and I stood in the hardware store longer than necessary choosing that color, aware that repainting something symbolic feels almost ceremonial. The plumbing was repaired, the dripping faucet silenced, and then we pulled up the stained carpet in the hallway and discovered hardwood floors beneath. Floors he had covered decades ago because he didn't like the sound of footsteps echoing through the house. That detail stayed with me. He didn't like the sound of movement. He preferred control, so complete it muted even the evidence of someone walking away. Sanded and sealed those floors, the house began to sound different, brighter, more honest. Footsteps echoed now, doors opened fully, windows stayed unlocked in the afternoon light. One evening, while I was repainting the kitchen cabinets, my mother sat at the counter watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. She told me he was staying with a cousin, that it wasn't comfortable, that pride doesn't shrink easily even when circumstances do. I asked her if he blamed me. She hesitated and said he blamed the bank. Of course he did. Accountability had never been his preferred language. I sat alone on the porch steps and stared at the yard, the same yard where the burn barrel once stood, and I felt something unsettling. I had changed the locks, replaced the roof, restored the floors, but the question remained heavier than any renovation. Was this justice, or was this inheritance of damage? Because control does not disappear when paperwork changes hands, it simply finds new shapes. And if I wasn't careful, I could become another version of authority inside these walls. The real power wasn't in owning the house. It was in deciding what kind of presence would live inside it now. And that decision would be tested sooner than I. He called in October, when the marigolds had bloomed bright orange in the backyard, exactly where the burn barrel once stood. A quiet act of reclamation that no one on the street fully understood except me. His name appeared on my phone, and for a moment I simply stared at it, aware that 6 years of silence can feel safer than one unpredictable conversation. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded older, roughened by something heavier than time. He said my name carefully, as if testing whether he was still allowed to use it. I replied with his, not Dad, not anything soft, just Gerald, and the silence that followed carried more history than either of us could articulate. He heard the house looked different now. I said it did. He began a sentence he couldn't finish, something about never thinking I would actually go through with it, and I realized in that moment that he had always believed my ambition would bend before his certainty. Then his voice shifted slightly, not fully apologetic, but less rigid. He said he made mistakes. It wasn't an apology shaped properly, but it was the closest he had come. I could have listed every detail: the fire, the humiliation, the years of isolation, the narrative he spread to protect himself. But instead I asked him one question that had been sitting in my chest since I opened that shoebox. Why did you keep the fabric? On the other end of the line was sharp enough to tell me he hadn't expected that. There was a long pause before he admitted he shouldn't have burned it, that he couldn't undo what he did, that reaching into the ashes afterward didn't fix anything. It was regret without repair, acknowledgement without courage. In that moment, I understood something uncomfortable. He was not a villain carved from stone. He was a man who mistook dominance for strength and learned too late that control collapses when money does. I told him calmly that I wasn't giving the house back, that I wasn't pretending nothing happened, but that I also wasn't interested in destroying him. The words felt measured, deliberate, chosen carefully so they did not carry the same cruelty I once endured. About my mother, I told him she was safe, and for the first time he did not challenge that statement. When the call ended, I sat quietly and realized something profound. He lost the house the same way he lost me, by believing neither of us would ever leave. But ownership had taught me something he never learned. Power is loud when it feels threatened. Strength is quiet when it no longer needs permission. And now the final choice was not about him at all. It was about what kind of legacy I would build on soil that once held. The real test did not come in a dramatic confrontation, or a shouting match in the driveway, or even another phone call filled with unfinished apologies. It came quietly, disguised as opportunity. A developer from 2 towns over contacted me in early spring, someone who had been buying up older properties along our street with the intention of tearing them down and building larger, modern homes with wide glass fronts and stone facades that looked impressive but carried no memory. He offered a number high enough to make even my steady hands pause over the email. It was more than double what I had paid at auction, more than enough to turn the entire experience into a clean, profitable victory. From a business perspective, it was perfect timing. The market was climbing, the renovations were complete, and emotionally I owed that structure nothing. Selling would have been efficient, strategic, detached. Efficiency does not always equal resolution. I walked through the house that evening alone, letting my fingers brush along the smooth banister, listening to the echo of footsteps on the hardwood floors we had uncovered, floors once hidden because the sound of movement made him uncomfortable. Now every step sounded intentional, unapologetic. The kitchen cabinets gleamed under soft light, the roof no longer leaked, and the backyard held bright rows of marigolds planted deliberately where fire once consumed everything I loved. If I sold, the house would disappear, replaced by something architecturally superior and emotionally empty. The burn barrel spot would become a landscaped patio. The bedroom closet where I found the fabric would be demolished. The air itself would forget what happened here. I realized then that selling would not feel like closure. It would feel like erasure. A week later, I invited him over. Not as a daughter seeking reconciliation, not as a wounded child demanding apology, but as the legal owner extending controlled access. I chose a Saturday afternoon when the sunlight made the house look open instead of intimidating. When he stepped out of his cousin's sedan and looked up at the exterior, freshly painted and steady, something shifted in his posture. For years he had stood in that driveway as unquestioned authority. Now he waited at the edge of the walkway until I nodded for him to approach. Power does not need to announce itself when it is documented in ink. Slowly through each room, hands clasped behind his back, eyes absorbing changes he would never have approved of before. The hardwood floors creaked confidently under his steps. The walls were lighter, the windows unblocked. In the kitchen, he paused longer than necessary, perhaps remembering how many dinners had been eaten in silence at that table. My mother was not home. I had arranged that intentionally. This moment was not about triangulation or tension. It was about clarity. The backyard, he stopped at the edge of the marigolds. The orange petals moved gently in the breeze, rooted exactly where the barrel once stood. He didn't ask why I planted them there. He knew. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, in a voice stripped of performance, he said he never imagined I would turn the place into something softer. I told him softness and strength are not opposites. They simply require different kinds of courage. Once, and for the first time in my life, he did not attempt to justify what he had done. He did not rewrite the story. He did not say I was dramatic or sensitive or rebellious. He simply stood in the evidence of change and accepted that it no longer belonged to him. Left, he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me something folded carefully in tissue paper. I already knew what it was before I opened it. The remaining piece of quilt fabric, the part he had kept all these years. He said he thought it should stay with the house. I corrected him. Time did what time always does. It softened edges without deleting history. My mother continued living in the house under her own name on a lease agreement that guaranteed her stability. I expanded my business into a second location, then a third, each decision guided not by revenge but by deliberate construction. The house became less a battleground and more a marker, proof that destruction can be repurposed without being denied. Later, I received another offer from the developer, even higher than before. This time I didn't hesitate before declining. I had come to understand something fundamental. The greatest revenge is not humiliation, it is evolution. If I tore the house down for profit, I would still be reacting to him. If I preserved it intentionally, I was responding only to myself. Next anniversary of the fire, I stood in the backyard at dusk, holding both pieces of the quilt fabric stitched together carefully by my own hands. The seam was visible, imperfect, honest. I did not try to hide the burn marks. They were part of the design now. The air smelled like cut grass instead of smoke, and the marigolds glowed quietly in the fading light. I thought about the girl who watched her belongings burn and believed that survival meant silence. I thought about the woman who signed auction papers with steady hands, and I understood something with a clarity that no confrontation could have given me. Teach me a lesson with fire. What he actually taught me was ownership. Ownership of property. Ownership of narrative. The most powerful part of all was this: I did not rebuild the house to prove him wrong. I rebuilt it to prove to myself that nothing he burned was the source of my worth. That night were loud, dramatic, unforgettable.